All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our first guest on the show today is Kelley B. Vlahos. She writes for us at antiwar.com, also, of course, at the American Conservative magazine. And got a couple of great articles here I want to talk with her about. Welcome back to the show, Kelley. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Well, I appreciate you joining us today. Let's start with this piece here at antiwar.com/Vlahos. Surge finally getting a second look. Could it really be true that anyone, I don't know, east of the Mississippi River decided that they would try to examine the actual facts beneath the propaganda narrative that surges work, and the surge is working, and the surge did work, and the next surge will be great too, and everybody knows that surges are things that work. Someone is taking a second look at that?
Well, I mean, this is typical Washington. I mean, as I mentioned in the piece, I mean, there's been no lack of criticism or scrutiny into the surge since the moment it began or was, crafted by the Kagans and Petraeus and all his helpmates and handlers back in 2007. I mean, we've been criticizing it on antiwar.com for years, and more recently criticizing the mythology of the surge as A, having worked, and B, being a template that could be used in Afghanistan. But as Washington goes, I mean, we might have had, a grip on the truth years ago, but until so-called, quote-unquote, credible voices start looking at this and giving it a second look, then somehow, it doesn't become a real criticism. And what I point out is that now among the military blogosphere, and particularly in think tanks in which people, like former officers who have worked, with Petraeus and have been advisors in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're starting to take a second look. And so now it's becoming news and becoming more of a serious exercise. Doesn't take away from all of the criticism and the fine, perseverance of people like, say, Phil Giraldi or Gareth Parter, people who write for antiwar.com. I'm just pointing out that finally, there's grumbling within the military itself, within the military community, that perhaps Petraeus, A, is getting too much credit for what happened in Iraq, and B, what really happened there. Let's take a second look.
Yeah, I like that. They're just jealous, so he gets to be a big star. Well, now here's the thing too. They all knew that they were lying, basically, right? Because the entire setup for the surge work theory is that he took command. David Petraeus took command of the Iraq War just as the Civil War was ending. After they had helped for years on end, they'd helped the Shiites wage this civil war against the Sunni Arabs of Baghdad and so-called cleanse them to where it was a 85% Shiite city right around the time he got there. And then all he did was accept the same surrender that the Sunni-based insurgency had been offering since 2003, which is, if you'll just let us patrol our own neighborhoods, give us a little bit of money and some guns, we'll stop fighting you. So that was his brilliant, victory in war, is that he bribed the enemy to stop shooting him, and even then waited until they were in the very weakest position of all, not because of his efforts, but because all the generals that came before him, helping Muqtada al-Sadr and Abdulaziz al-Hakim, put drills in the Sunni Arab skulls to death, and eventually forced them all out of Baghdad. I mean, everyone in the military knew that, as well as everybody at antiwar.com knew that, right? That right. The surge didn't do anything. It was just a coincidence in timing.
Well, the surge, the idea of the surge with a capital S is developed into a template for a counterinsurgency strategy. When in reality, which, now people like, Douglas Ollivant, who I point out in my piece, he was a national security, he's a national security fellow now at the New America Foundation, but he was once an advisor for Petraeus. He points out that this isn't a strategy. These were tactical decisions made by the generals. Mostly to get our fannies out of Iraq and with some semblance of, pride and integrity left. This was not a strategy, quote unquote, that could be later on overlaid onto the Afghanistan war. And so he's pointing out that as a strategy, if we're looking at this as a strategy, we are lost. And he points out that it has not worked. COIN, or counterinsurgency, as molded by this sort of surge in Iraq, has not worked in Afghanistan, nor will it, because, as you pointed out, the dynamics were completely different, and they were mostly out of our control. Whereas the mythology has Petraeus riding in on a white horse with his 30,000 additional troops. He comes in, he starts, laying down all these counterinsurgency sort of tenets, and the place just, magically, becomes safer for Iraqis, safer for political resolution. And, next thing you know, you have Thomas Ricks and, all of the other punditry class talking about how we won the war thanks to David Petraeus. And what Oliphant points out, quite rightly, is that's just not what happened. A lot of the dynamics were out of our control, and the United States and, including, Petraeus and, Crocker and others were sort of helpmates to bringing the violence down. But the political resolution is not there, and it's still a mess, and we're seeing all that today. But, the mainstream media, ends up oversimplifying everything for the lowest common denominator audience anyway, and they've oversimplified this surge and what it means. And it's all in David Petraeus' favor because it makes him look like he single-handedly saved the war in Iraq when he didn't.
Yeah, well, and it's too bad that, back at the time when they were trying to push all this on us, it was all accepted so uncritically because the phrase, the surge is working, and the surge worked repeated so many times. Now Here we are 3-4 years later, and it's basically just stuck that way when, in fact, at the time, the people like yourself who were, taking a look critically at what was going on there, could see that it was all just a bunch of hogwash. I mean, you go back and look at The Good Soldiers by the Washington Post reporter David Finkel. It's the team from, or the group from the Collateral Murder video. When they called off the war against the Sunni insurgency, they went ahead and took the war to East Baghdad against the Sodderists. And Lieutenant Colonel Kozlarich is portrayed in this book as just worshiping this new COIN doctrine. Wow, we got the new book about how to do it. Come on, guys. And he was really gung-ho about it. But within just a few weeks, it was sitting there collecting dust on his desk, and they never picked it up again. It was just, they didn't believe in it at all in the U.S. Army. It was nonsense. It was really, as I think you've said on the show before, it was about adding time to the Washington clock, not really changing anything in Iraq.
Right, exactly. So in that regard, on that level, the surge did work. If the surge was instituted to maintain the general's reputation, to get us out of this war, to start withdrawing at some point, to save face, with some level of dignity, strategic messaging, effort, then it did work. But if the surge was supposed to make way for long-term stability, political and otherwise, and establish Iraq as a friend in that region, as a geopolitical ally in that region, it did not work. And I don't think that the mainstream media has made that that difference clear to us as an audience. And what I was trying to point out is that it's bubbling up through military circles.
Right.
Instead,
well, we'll see if that can get mainstream attention at least. And, of course, as you say, this became not just a myth about the great victory in Iraq, but this became the basis for let's do the same thing in Afghanistan. And maybe we can talk a little bit about how well that's working out when we get back from this break, everybody. It's Kelley Vlahos from the American Conservative and antiwar.com. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Kelley B. Vlahos from the American Conservative Magazine and antiwar.com. That's original.antiwar.com/Vlahos. I think if you just put antiwar.com/Vlahos, it'll forward you on there. Anyway, so we're talking about this great piece, Surge finally getting a second look. And I still do want to fit in some here about Obama being great for business as long as you receive dividend checks from Blackwater or XE or whatever it's called now. But first, I wanted to, I think I probably interrupted you too much. I'd like to give you a little bit more chance to describe some of this dissent against the Petraeus surge worked myth in D.C. and in the military. And then maybe we can go over and talk about its application in Afghanistan a little bit more. But I think most of this criticism that you're citing is about Iraq. Am I correct?
Yeah. I think what I've been hearing for a couple of years now, and off the record conversations, casual conversations with people within the military community, is that David Petraeus isn't as well liked, in the ranks, and among other senior officers as he might be portrayed in the sort of slavish media coverage that he's been getting over the last 2 years. David Petraeus he is an outstanding politician, of his time. He's a political general. And, he knows exactly, what pathways to take, who's back to scratch, and, what messages to send. And one of the key things that he's done as a political general is surround himself with adoring media. His access to the media is legendary, or media access to him is legendary. So much of the coverage has been fawning, and I think it's reached a saturation point for many within the military who sort of acknowledged his star, in the past, and saw that as sort of a natural outgrowth of this sort of path that he's taken as a political general. But I think people are getting fed up with it because, for a couple of reasons. One, that when this coin template was placed on the Afghan war, there was a lot of hand-wringing over that to begin with. Well, now it's clearly not working. And to see General Petraeus continue to get all of these accolades for his, surge in Iraq is sort of kicking sand in the wound or salt in the wound. It's getting increasingly difficult to sort of whitewash what happened in Iraq, because we're seeing all this violence happening in Iraq, and realize that the political situation there is a mess, and it's not getting better, and they are not turning out to be our best ally. Iran has more influence than we do over there. And then we see violence up in Afghanistan, more dangerous for our soldiers, which I think is key. Sadly, you and I and people at antiwar.com have been beating the drums for civilian casualties for years. But what really gets noticed in the mainstream and among the military community is when there's an uptick in violence against our soldiers, which has been happening for over a year now. So I think when you see David Petraeus and these various photo ops, whether it be in front of Congress or his retirement ceremony, and he's continually to be played up as King David, I think it's starting to really irk people, so that these private conversations about Petraeus and this sort of the mythologizing is now reaching the blogosphere, where people are going, enough already. Which I quoted one noted blogger, military blogger, Carl Prine. He's an Iraq veteran. He's been a critic of coin, but he's certainly pro-military, saying, come on, stop the hagiography here. Let's call it for what it was. This surge was, A, not so successful, and B, it wasn't all Petraeus's to his credit in the first place. And I think that I wanted to write about that, because I think that is starting to see the legend break down. And I, interview a friend of mine, Doug McGregor, also a veteran senior officer, who points out, once we accept the fact that the surge is a sham, that's when this mythologizing will stop, and Petraeus' star will finally fall. And I'm sure there's not going to be a lot of people crying about that within the military.
Well, I guess I have to go back to, but didn't they know they were lying all along? Back in 2007, when they escalated the war and when Bush announced the escalation, the entire theory was, we're going to achieve these benchmarks. And that phrase was almost as popular in the media as the surge is working at the time. And it was supposed to be in I forget, August or September, that Petraeus was supposed to go to Congress and report on his benchmarks and how well he had achieved them. They put it off for a month. I guess he showed up, I think it was supposed to be September, and he showed up in October and said, well, never mind the benchmarks. But the surge worked anyway, or something like that. But the benchmark, number one, supposedly was we're going to create so much peace in Baghdad that all the different political factions in the country can get together in their parliament and work out all their differences through the democratic system instead of blowing each other up. And they never did do that.
Right. But see, it's all about images, and it's all about, sort of like the emotional impact. And what they did, just like you pointed out, the violence was down because the civil war had come to an end. The Sunnis lost, and they knew it. So they were able to be bought off, work to get rid of Al-Qaeda. They were, they'd already been ethnically cleansed throughout, Iraq. So the violence was down. There's a debate now on whether, Petraeus caused that or not, but the violence was down. Well,
if anything, he escalated it because he went and picked a fight with the solderists for no reason.
Right. But the solderists, they stood down. They made a tactical, a decision to stand down and wait this thing out. So, statistically and on the news, visually, the violence was down. Things looked better. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to capture. The political stuff is harder to capture. Once Americans, who are barely paying attention in the first place, see the nightly news and they see that violence is down and things are moving along, they tune out. Nobody tuned back in to realize that political reconciliation never happened. The oil money wasn't flowing, to the people. That, there were, still 5 million people displaced. Nobody tuned in for the rest of that. So he was able to, deflect and, and procrastinate on these benchmark meetings, in Congress, because at that point nobody cared anymore.
Right.
They just wanted to see the violence go down. Yeah, the violence was down. And it's still down if you're going to compare it to, say, 2005 levels.
Right.
But, today, you see bombings every day there.
Yeah, it's horrible. Now, you won't see that on TV, but you'll see that in the headlines at antiwar.com, that's for sure.
Correct.
And now, to the Afghanistan thing, it's amazing. I guess, again, if the victory really is adding time to the Washington clock, then I guess it counts. But if they really thought that they were going to take the surge model from Iraq and apply it in Afghanistan, they're hugely and terribly mistaken. In Iraq, they were fighting a civil war on the side of the majority. In Afghanistan, they're fighting a up mountain battle, never even mind hills, and they can never win there. They're fighting to install a tiny minority that has made allies with the Indians and whatever. They're not going to be able to hold on to that place without the U.S. military there to protect them for one day.
Right.
They still call Karzai the mayor of Kabul. In fact, it was Stanley McChrystal and his guys called him the mayor of his palace. He sits in the palace doing heroin all day. He's not even the mayor of Kabul anymore.
Well, you could see that Washington is getting a little nervous because, in response to these attacks in Kabul the other day, they're saying, well, this just proves the desperation and the last throes of the Taliban insurgency. And they're like, okay, reality check here,
Yeah, just like the Tet Offensive showed that the NVA were near defeat.
Right. It's a joke. And I think anybody with half a wit that saw these attacks the other day, that, they know that this just proves that things have gone so badly over there. Well,
and they had their test cases, Marja and Kandahar. Did they make any progress in either of those cities? The clear, hold, and build doctrine?
Yeah, government in a box.
Right.
And with Kabul, that was the test case for whether the Afghan military was able to secure by themselves a population center, because they've had the Afghans have had full control of the security there for a while now. So the Taliban struck right at the heart of our sort of plan there, which is to build up Afghan security so they can take over their country once and for all.
Yep.
So if it's all about message, like the surge, and this is all about message, they're winning. The Taliban is winning.
Yep. All right. Well, again, we didn't have time to talk about Blackwater, but I want everybody to check out Who Says Obama's Bad for Business at antiwar.com/Vlahos. Also a great piece. This one is Surge finally getting a second look. Thank you very much for your time, Kelley.
Thank you.